We will defeat your world government. We will defeat world taxation. We will defeat your control grid. God is on our side. I stand before the creator of the universe, and I ask the creator of the universe, as our founding fathers did in 1776, you will and you are failing now. Your new world order will fall. Humanity will defeat you. The answer to 1984 is 1776.
From 1763 to 1783, Florida was officially British territory. It was divided into East and West Florida at the Apalachicola River in the Panhandle. In the final 8 years of their occupation of the peninsular territory, the British monarchy was at war with 13 of her colonies. Starting with Massachusetts, American colonists started protesting what they considered to be unfair policies coming from the Crown. Once the protests turned into war, the British thought it to be wise, like their Spanish and French counterparts, to utilize a black militia to assist them in their battle against their cousins on the other side of the pond. Colonial Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation by the end of the year in 1775 pronouncing all runaway slaves that make it to British lines and fight for the crown shall be freed in exchange for their services. Lord Dunmore's proclamation is what turned Britain's southern colonies against the crown. Florida, being Britain's most southern territory on continental North America at the time, did not secede with the northern neighbors. Renowned historian Gerald Horne posits that, quote, the legacy of Spanish Florida had not dissipated. This is, the presence of a corps of armed Africans and what had become an industry of annoying Georgia by providing refuge to escaping Africans. Still, there was worriment about arming Africans to confront rebels, though this was hardly avoidable. Moreover, Seminoles and Creeks had pledged to back the crown. As things turned out, scores of armed Africans prevented the defection of Florida. Close quote. After the colonies declared independence from Britain in the summer of 1776, scores of Africans flooded into St. Augustine from South Carolina and Georgia. While the Continental Army did not allow blacks in their military until 1778, the British Redcoats were very receptive of the Africans who saw the incentive to take up arms against their former masters. By the end of the war, 20,000 blacks fought on the side of the British compared to the 5,000 blacks that fought on the side of the American colonists. In 1781, after the Battle of Yorktown, the British fled to Florida, the Bahamas, and other Caribbean islands with thousands of enslaved and formerly enslaved peoples. Many of the now free black allies of the British who assisted them in the war against the American colonists made Florida their home. During the British era, blacks would constitute a majority of the population in Florida. After the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war between the 13 American colonies on one side and the British on the other, Florida was retroceded to the Spanish. However, there were many British loyalist farmers who had established farms in the area under the more flexible Spanish laws. Some would defend later when the U.S. tried to invade during the Patriot War in 1812. Nevertheless, the second Spanish colonial government, just south of the slave-holding newly independent United States, offered religious sanctuary for those fleeing persecution. This offering, obviously, would include the African runaways. For the first 6 years, Africans continued to escape into the re-established Spanish territory. Under U.S. President George Washington's administration, the Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson pressured Spain to abandon their policy of legally accepting the self-liberating Africans into their territory. This foreign policy arranged by Thomas Jefferson is the first example of the United States government working tirelessly to strip the land of Florida for the freedom that it provided for the many thousands that lived there. Jefferson, as an affluent slave owner who profited tremendously off the institution, has a conflicting record on his public stance on slavery. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he acknowledged the wrongs of slavery until other Southern delegates encouraged him to take the passage out. On the other hand, He also fought for slavery to expand into the Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River, upon the establishment of the country. He reversed President John Adams' policy of supporting the African rebels of the Haitian Revolution and feared that they would inspire Africans to rise up and overthrow their captors in the South, but at the same time empathized with Black Revolution when he proposed relocation instead of execution for the Gabriel Prosser conspirators of the year 1800. Jefferson proposed that Prosser and other Black rebels in the United States be sent to Saint-Domingue. He stated that the, quote, West Indies offer a more probable and practicable retreat for them. The most promising portion of them is the island of Saint-Domingue, where the blacks are established into a sovereignty de facto and have organized themselves under regular laws and government, close quote. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, it was apparent that Jefferson and other founding fathers lived in fear of Black revolution. Jefferson stated in reference to a potential Black uprising in the United States in 1782, quote, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. Close quote. Black revolution was fomenting throughout the West Indies during this time, and Florida, geographically, was inextricably linked to the Caribbean world. As revolutionary Africans continued to escape into Florida, forming Black militias as well as sustainable communities, enticing enslaved Africans from southern plantations to seek refuge in their communities, the U.S. government began to put their focus on the acquisition of the territory. In addition to this avaricious thirst for acquiring neighboring territories, this quest for the acquisition of land was also fueled by the fear of the Spanish and British landholdings in close proximity to the United States, in which the European nations may use the opportunity-seeking Africans in their quest for a land grab from a newborn country. After America's war for independence, Spanish territory virtually surrounded the United States, with Louisiana on the west side, New Spain in the southwest, and the Floridas on the south side. In the 1790s, with turmoil reaching Europe due to the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, as well as the many wars between nations that sprang from it, backroom deals and new alliances formed. Indubitably, a young United States will be caught in the middle of all of this. According to James Cusick, in 1800, the Spanish crown, in an effort to appease Napoleon, secretly ceded its province of Louisiana back to France. However, after it became clear that the Africans in Saint-Domingue were going to overthrow the lucrative sugar colony indefinitely and establish themselves a free nation, Napoleon, being pressed for cash for his wars of expansion in Europe after the loss of Saint-Domingue, decided to sell the Louisiana Territory to Thomas Jefferson for $15 million, or about 4 cents an acre, in 1803. There were disputes between the United States and Spain about the boundaries between where Louisiana began and West Florida ended. But ultimately, the goal of Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe was to eventually take Florida, especially when it was realized that the British and the Spanish, two historic enemies who had territory surrounding the United States, were now allies in 1808 during Napoleon's wars. While all of this conflict was going on throughout the Atlantic world, the Africans, who were caught in the middle of all this, continued to fight for their freedom and win by strategically allying themselves with their enemy's enemy. By the early 1800s, the most definitive enemy of the black man in North America was the United States government and their quest for expansion. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, cotton production expanded, and so too did slavery. States like Georgia, and especially South Carolina, increased their imports of Africans straight from the continent exponentially in the 1790s and early 1800s. The years 1806 and 1807 were by far the largest number of Africans ever imported in individual years into South Carolina straight from the continent, amounting to over 32,000 between those 2 years. In addition, Cuba increased their slave trade from Africa right around the same period. Many slave owners in the South took advantage of these markets, especially after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the United States in 1808. Lastly, the domestic slave trade was also on the rise, with African Americans being sold from Virginia into the newly developing territories of the Deep South just outside of the Floridas, with the newly arriving enslaved Africans continuing to escape down into East Florida, adding to the revolutionary appeal and the threat of the German Coast slave revolt just outside of West Florida. In present-day Louisiana, planters across southern Georgia began to petition Congress to invade Spanish Florida in what was called the Patriot War.